November 18, 1942. The sun over Guadalcanal burned with a hard, pitiless light. The sea below glittered like molten metal, and the air vibrated with the deep, distant hum of engines. High above Henderson Field, a lone Japanese pilot in a Mitsubishi A6M Zero tightened his grip on the control stick. He was young but not inexperienced, a man who'd been taught since flight school that nothing could climb like his aircraft. Yet something was climbing faster. Through the canopy he saw them, strange shapes lifting off the American strip. Not the stocky, familiar Wildcats, not bombers, something else. Twin booms, long wings, a slender center pod, like a dragonfly with the heart of a hawk. He blinked, adjusted his goggles. They weren't supposed to be this fast. They weren't supposed to exist at all. The Zeros were flying at the altitude where they usually ruled the sky. Here, they could spiral, dance, force their opponents into slow-turning fights where the Zeros' agility always won. It was the choreography of dominance, repeated again and again since Pearl Harbor. But now in the humid air above Guadalcanal, that familiar rhythm faltered. The new American fighters didn't circle. They rose, straight up, smooth, relentless, like predators climbing the food chain. The young pilot radioed a brief, confused report. His wingman didn't reply at first. He was staring too. "What are those?" No one in his squadron had an answer. Below, Henderson Field trembled as the twin-engine Lightnings gathered speed. They were P-38s, an aircraft few Japanese pilots had ever seen in combat. American intelligence had kept their debut quiet. Mechanics on the ground called them big birds, but the men climbing into their cockpits knew something more. This machine was built to change the rules of the Pacific War. Its engines screamed as the Lightnings carved their way upward. Within minutes, they were at a height the Zeros would need precious time to reach. And time, in air combat, was a currency more valuable than fuel. Up where the air thinned, the Zero pilot tried to climb with them. His plane began to shudder. The Zero had ruled the skies at low and medium altitudes, but it was never meant to sprint straight upward against turbo-supercharged power. He pushed the throttle forward, but the gap widened. He felt it, not just as a pilot, but as a man. A cold realization seeping through his bones. The hunter was no longer on top of the food chain. In the American cockpits, Lightning pilots prepared their attack. They had trained to use their speed and altitude advantage, never to get caught in a turning brawl. One of them, barely 23, whispered to himself over the oxygen hiss. "Let's show them how high eagles fly." Their plan was simple and brutal. Stay above, strike from altitude, and disappear before the Zeros could even respond. These weren't duels. This was controlled violence delivered at speed. The Japanese formation began to break apart as the Lightnings reached firing position. The Zero pilots tried to turn sharply, hopping to force the Americans into the kind of dogfight they'd always won. But the Americans never took the bait. They came down like falling stars. Gunfire split the silence. The P-38s concentrated nose guns, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, spat a clean, devastating stream. No convergence angles, no scattered fire, just one tight punch. One Zero exploded in a burst of flame. Another spiraled into the sea. The surviving Japanese pilots banked hard, desperate to gain altitude, but the climb was hopeless. Every meter gained brought heavier airframe strain, slower turns. Above them, the Lightnings rolled away, climbing again to the thin blue. For the first time, Zero pilots weren't dictating the battle. They were reacting to it. And reaction in the sky often meant death. Back at their base, the survivors would later describe the shock. They'd seen strange aircraft before, but this felt different. It wasn't just speed. It was control. It was precision. The Zero had always been the hunter. Today, it felt like prey. They rose into the sun, one pilot wrote in his logbook, as if gravity no longer mattered to them. This wasn't simply a tactical setback. It was a moment that cracked the myth of invincibility built since 1941, a myth that said Japanese pilots and their Zeros could never be outmatched. On the ground, American mechanics watched the Lightning's return. Their engines ticked in the heat. The pilots climbed out with the slow, controlled movements of men who knew something fundamental had shifted. Henderson Field wasn't just a runway anymore. It was the launch pad for a new kind of war. The battle that day lasted minutes. The consequences would echo for years. In the mess tents that evening, Japanese commanders tried to frame what had happened. A fluke, perhaps, some new Allied trick, a pilot error, but their younger men whispered different things. They talked about speed they couldn't match, power they couldn't chase, a ceiling they couldn't touch. Whispers have a way of growing. And above all those whispers, somewhere in the darkness, the sound of twin engines still echoed, low, patient, unstoppable. In the weeks that followed, word spread through squadrons across the Pacific. There was a new shape in the sky. Its twin tail cut through the clouds like a warning. No longer could Zero pilots expect to meet clumsy bombers or underpowered fighters. The game board had changed. This was the day when the sky itself tilted. And for the men who had once soared with unchallenged confidence, the fall had just begun. Before the sound of the Lightning ever reached their ears, Japanese pilots had spent nearly a year believing the sky belonged to them. From the first shock of Pearl Harbor to the burning airfields across Southeast Asia, the Zero was not merely an airplane. It was a legend made of aluminum and faith. The A6M Zero had been designed with one purpose: to dominate the air. Its engineers stripped away weight wherever possible, sacrificing armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, even protection for the pilot. All to give it a turn radius so tight, and a climb rate so blistering that no Allied fighter of 1941 could match it. When it first appeared, the effect was immediate and devastating. In the Philippines, China, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots climbed into the cockpits of obsolete aircraft and found themselves outmaneuvered within seconds. A Zero could twist beneath its opponent, bleed off speed without losing control, and place its cannons exactly where it wanted. For many Allied crews, a dogfight against a Zero was not a contest. It was a sentence. This superiority wasn't only mechanical. It was psychological. Japanese naval aviators carried themselves with a quiet, almost sacred confidence. They believed in their training, in their aircraft, in the idea that they represented the most formidable air armada in the Pacific. Before each mission, commanders delivered speeches that sounded more like vows than orders. They spoke of the samurai spirit. They spoke of destiny, and their pilots took off believing no enemy could touch them. The early months of the war seemed to prove them right. Over Singapore, the Brewster Buffaloes burned. Over Java, Curtiss P-40s fell smoking into the jungle. In the skies above Burma, British Hurricanes were torn apart by men who flew as if they were part of their machines. The Zero moved like liquid light. No aircraft seemed able to stop it. Among the elite pilots was Saburo Sakai, one of the most feared aviators of the war. His name was whispered with the same awe the Zero inspired. By 1942, Sakai had already built a reputation as an ace who could read the sky like a map. He and men like him had survived countless missions and carried victory as casually as a flight helmet. The Imperial Japanese Navy's best believed they were untouchable, and for a time they were. Commanders at Rabaul and Truk spoke in measured tones about the Americans. They believed the enemy's fighters were too heavy, too slow, too poorly flown to be a threat. Even as intelligence trickled in about new designs, strange silhouettes, and whispered reports of a twin-boomed machine, few believed it mattered. They expected the next battle to be like the last. The Americans would bring their stubby Wildcats, they would turn too late, and they would fall from the sky like every opponent before. It is easy to forget now, when we view the Pacific War through the lens of hindsight, just how overwhelming the Japanese advantage seemed at the start. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Zero's reputation grew into something mythic. It wasn't just a fighter. It was proof that Japan had mastered the art of aerial combat. For the first time, Western powers faced an enemy whose aircraft could outfly, outclimb, and outfight their own. The heart of that belief lay not only in the design but in the pilots. These were not hastily trained young men. They were veterans of the war in China, where their tactics had been sharpened in real combat. They practiced formation flying with fanatical precision, drilled on energy management long before their enemies even understood the term, and honed their turning fights into an art form. They trusted that as long as they could bring an opponent into that turning circle, the outcome was inevitable. In briefings before missions, commanders spoke with a calm certainty that victory was guaranteed. Lieutenant Junichi Sass once told his men, "The Zero is our sword. No one has learned to parry it." For men raised in a culture that revered the warrior spirit, the airplane was more than metal. It was a blade forged to carve their destiny across the Pacific sky. And for a while it did just that. The Americans scrambled to adapt. Their aircraft were heavier, slower to climb, less agile in tight turns. Pilots learned to dive away when cornered, not to turn with the Zero, to survive rather than to win. The Japanese noticed. They laughed about it in their ready rooms. In the first half of the war, that laughter seemed justified. But confidence, like altitude, can evaporate faster than expected. Even as their victories mounted, quiet warnings flickered through intelligence briefings. There was talk of a new fighter, strange, powerful, unorthodox. It had 2 engines and a performance envelope that didn't match anything the Japanese doctrine had prepared for. Those reports were dismissed by many as exaggerated. The Zero's legend had grown too large to imagine a serious challenger. In the glow of early triumph, the Imperial Japanese Navy didn't see the shadow rising on the horizon. It was building in American factories, taking shape under the hands of engineers who thought about war not as a stage for individual glory, but as a problem to be solved with speed, power, and precision. When the Lightning finally arrived in the Pacific, it didn't announce itself with parades or headlines. It simply appeared in the sky one day over Guadalcanal. And on that day, the Empire's wings began to falter. The story of the P-38 Lightning does not begin in the Pacific, nor on a battlefield. It begins years earlier in the quiet halls of Lockheed, in a time when the world was holding its breath. In 1937, while the rising sun spread across Asia and Europe edged closer to war, the United States Army Air Corps sent out a challenge: build a fighter that could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything before it. It was a challenge that most believed impossible. But at Lockheed, a young designer named Clarence Kelly Johnson didn't see impossibility. He saw opportunity. Johnson and his team imagined something that broke every rule. Instead of a single engine, they would use 2. Instead of conventional lines, they drew an aircraft with twin booms and a central pod, a shape no fighter in the world had ever worn. They wanted speed beyond 400 miles per hour, an altitude ceiling above 40,000 feet, and the endurance to cross oceans. It was not a fighter meant for skirmishes over trenches. It was a machine built for the wide, unforgiving spaces of a global war. The result was the P-38 Lightning, a warplane that looked like it belonged to the future. Its turbo-supercharged Allison engines gave it a climb rate that stunned even American test pilots. Its long, elegant wings stretched more than 50 feet from tip to tip. Its cockpit sat like the heart of a predator between 2 gleaming tails. Where the Zero relied on lightness and agility, the Lightning embodied power, reach, and adaptability. It wasn't just the shape that was new. The entire philosophy behind it was different. Japanese aviation doctrine celebrated the pilot as the centerpiece, the warrior hero. American engineers, by contrast, placed their faith in the machine. The pilot was important, but the machine would make him lethal. Every inch of the P-38 was designed to give its pilot control over when to fight, where to fight, and how to escape. In war, that control would prove everything. The P-38's weaponry reflected that cold logic. Instead of guns spread across the wings, Its armament was packed in the nose: 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20 mm cannon firing through the propeller arc in a tight, devastating line. At range, it hit with the precision of a scalpel. At close distance, it tore aircraft apart in seconds. Its engineers had designed a fighter that could engage before the enemy even realized it was in danger. But as revolutionary as the Lightning was on paper, its road to war wasn't smooth. Early models suffered from technical flaws. Compressibility at high speeds made dives dangerous. Engines needed fine-tuning. Its complexity intimidated pilots used to simpler fighters. It arrived in the Pacific with whispers of skepticism trailing behind it. Yet those who flew it, those who learned to trust the twin engines and the long legs of its range, knew they were sitting on something extraordinary. The Lightning was built for the Pacific. The vast ocean distances between bases and targets made most Allied fighters struggle to reach the front. The Zero had been designed to exploit this, its incredible range giving it free rein. But the P-38 flipped that equation. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, loiter over battlefields, and return with fuel to spare. Where the Zero's reach had once seemed endless, the Lightning stretched farther. Inside its cockpit, the pilot sat in a pressurized seat with a clear view ahead. American designers understood that situational awareness could save lives, and the Lightning's wide canopy gave a sweeping view of the horizon. Up high, with the sun behind them and the enemy struggling below, Lightning pilots could pick their moment like a hawk spotting prey. By 1942, those early technical problems were being solved. New production runs ironed out weaknesses. Training programs expanded. Men who had flown P-40s and struggled against the Zero transitioned to the Lightning and immediately understood they were now holding the high cards. Japanese pilots prided themselves on maneuverability, on winning in a turning fight. The P-38 was never designed to play that game. It was designed to climb higher, dive faster, and strike with force the Zero could not match. Its strength was altitude and speed, and when combined with disciplined tactics, it was a weapon that ignored the rules of the old dogfight. The philosophy behind it was as modern as the machine itself. American war planners saw the coming conflict not as a series of duels but as a vast, coordinated campaign of attrition and control. The Lightning was a weapon of that new age. It didn't care for elegance or honor in the sky. It was there to kill, survive, and return to strike again. For the pilots who would fly it over Guadalcanal, this aircraft felt less like a plane and more like a blade hidden in the clouds. It didn't need to dance with its opponent. It only needed one pass, a dive from above, a line of fire, and then the sky was empty again. The Japanese had spent years building a legend around the Zero. They believed no fighter could touch it. But in California, Lockheed had quietly built something faster, stronger, and smarter. The Lightning wasn't just another airplane. It was a storm, forged in thunder and steel, waiting for its first strike. Soon, it would rise from Henderson Field, and in that moment, Japanese pilots would discover that their era of unquestioned dominance was ending. The day the P-38 Lightning entered combat over Guadalcanal began like so many others on that island: hot, bright, and brutal. Henderson Field was little more than a scar on the jungle, its runways pounded by monsoon rain and patched with crushed coral. The men who flew from it were exhausted from weeks of relentless fighting. But on that November morning in 1942, something different filled the air. A low, rising growl of engines that sounded unlike anything the Japanese pilots had faced before. In the distance, Mitsubishi Zeros patrolled with their usual confidence. They owned this altitude. For nearly a year, they had dictated the terms of every battle in the Pacific, climbing high, forcing Allied fighters into turning duels they could never win. But as the morning haze burned away, the familiar script began to unravel. From the southern edge of the island, the twin-boomed silhouettes of Lightning fighters rose into the sky like predators scenting their prey. Japanese pilots saw them first as dots, then shapes, then impossibly fast climbing forms. For a moment there was confusion. Some thought they were bombers. Some thought they were a trick of the light. Then the climb continued, steep and smooth, far beyond what a bomber could manage. 1-0 pilot radioed a warning, his voice tight with disbelief. The enemy was climbing too quickly. No one in his unit had ever seen an American aircraft do that. Above him, the Lightnings leveled out 5,000 feet higher, owning the vertical space where the Zero struggled to breathe. Up in the thin air, P-38 pilots adjusted their masks, checked their gun switches, and prepared to strike. They had been trained for this moment. Use their altitude advantage, control the engagement, hit hard, and never get dragged into a slow turn. From above, they could see the entire Japanese formation spread out like a fan, unaware that the world had changed. The attack began with no warning. The Lightnings rolled inverted and dove as one, their twin engines howling like a storm breaking loose. Their speed in the dive was terrifying. The Zero, built light and nimble, became sluggish when pushed too fast. Above 300 miles per hour, its controls stiffened, its legendary maneuverability dissolving into clumsy resistance. The Lightning didn't suffer the same fate. Its pilots kept control all the way down. Tracer fire ripped through the sky. Concentrated bursts from the P-38's nose guns hit with surgical precision. 1-0 was cut apart before its pilot even saw who had hit him. Another tried to climb away but stalled in the thin air. A third rolled hard, desperate to escape, but the Americans had already pulled back up into the sun, untouchable. The engagement lasted minutes. When it ended, the Japanese formation was scattered. 3 Zeros were gone and the rest limped away, shaken and disoriented. The Americans lost none. It wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was the way it had happened. For the first time, the Zero had been outclimbed, outsped, and outgunned. Back at their base, the surviving Japanese pilots struggled to explain what they had seen. They spoke of fighters that seemed to rise without effort, that struck from above and vanished before a response was even possible. Their commanders dismissed some of these reports at first, but the young men who had seen those silver shapes knew what they had felt. It was fear. Not the sharp, fleeting fear of combat. The deep, heavy kind that settles in the gut when you realize the rules have changed. At Henderson Field, Lightning pilots climbed down from their cockpits, sweat-streaked and grinning. Their aircraft, still shimmering with heat, had just delivered a message that needed no translation. The age of the Zero's effortless dominance was over. For months, Japanese doctrine had relied on the assumption that American fighters couldn't climb or strike from higher altitudes. The Zero's pilots had come to believe they were the hunters, circling the sky with impunity. Now they had met something that didn't play their game. The P-38 didn't try to turn tighter. It didn't need to. It controlled the battle from above like a hawk controlling a flock of smaller birds. The encounter rippled through Japanese units like a silent shockwave. In Rabaul, officers listened to the combat reports with furrowed brows. Intelligence had mentioned a twin-engine fighter before, but few had taken it seriously. How could something so big move like that? How could anything outclimb a Zero? The disbelief began to give way to something colder. The P-38 was not just a new opponent. It was a new kind of opponent. It fought in a way that ignored everything the Japanese had built their confidence upon. It didn't circle. It didn't chase. It struck once and disappeared. For the pilots who flew the Zero, this was more than a tactical surprise. It was the first fracture in a myth they had lived inside for years. The myth of invincibility, of superiority, of the Zero as an untouchable weapon. Up in the clear skies above Guadalcanal, that myth had been shot through with streams of .50 caliber fire. In the coming months, the Lightning would grow more familiar, its howl becoming the sound of a shifting war. But on this day, its arrival was sudden and absolute. A new predator had appeared in the Pacific sky, and the hunters of old had just realized they were now the hunted. The difference between the Zero and the Lightning was not just measured in metal or horsepower. It was measured in altitude, in seconds, in the way one aircraft made its pilots feel unstoppable, and the other made its enemies feel hunted. By early 1943, that difference was beginning to echo through every Japanese squadron in the Pacific. Pilots who once launched into the sky certain of their superiority were now climbing with doubt tucked beneath their flight harnesses. The Zero had been designed to rule low and medium altitudes, where its agility and light weight gave it an unmatched turning edge. But the Lightning fought in a dimension the Zero couldn't reach. Above 20,000 feet, where the air thinned and engines gasped for breath, the P-38's turbo-superchargers kept pushing it higher. While the Japanese engines lost power, the Lightning's twin Allisons still roared. For the first time, Zero pilots found themselves looking up, not down, and that single change tilted the entire balance of air combat. They tried to climb after the Lightnings, but the gap only grew. It wasn't just that they couldn't catch them. It was that the Lightnings could choose exactly when to strike. At those altitudes, American pilots had the power to dictate the fight. When they came down, they came fast, faster than the Zero could follow. When they wanted to leave, they climbed away like ghosts. In a turning fight, the Zero was graceful, even elegant, but at high speed its controls grew heavy. Above 300 miles per hour, its wings stopped answering with the same precision. At 350, it was fighting its own body just to bank. The P-38 had no such problem. It kept its authority in the dive. It could fire, pull up, and be gone before a Zero could even turn its nose. Japanese pilots wrote about this in their diaries and letters home. They spoke of shapes appearing out of nowhere, of gunfire cutting through the quiet, thin air, of enemies who attacked without warning and disappeared just as suddenly. They began to feel a constant tension, even when flying in friendly skis. A Lightning could be up there, waiting. The psychological impact of that kind of opponent is hard to describe. For years, Japanese aviators had carried themselves like men who owned the sky. Now every patrol felt like walking across thin ice. Every shadow above the clouds carried the possibility of death arriving at 400 miles per hour. Some pilots spoke openly of the fear. Others buried it, but it showed in their flying. More cautious climbs, tighter formations, nervous scanning of the horizon. In early briefings, squadron commanders still tried to frame the P-38 as just another American fighter, but their pilots knew better. This was not another Wildcat. This was not an aircraft that could be forced into a turn and outmaneuvered. It was faster. It was stronger. It was designed to fight a different kind of war. Veteran ace Saburo Sakai, a man who had once flown with total confidence, would later admit that the Zero could not engage the Lightning except under rare and perfect conditions. He spoke of the sinking realization that if the P-38 was above you, there was no fight. There was only survival. His words carried the weight of a nation's pride bending under the weight of reality. The tactical situation grew worse as American pilots learned to use their advantage with ruthless efficiency. They perfected what they called boom and zoom. The Lightning would climb above, wait for the Zeros to appear below, then dive in a straight, deadly line. A burst of fire, a kill, a clean pull-up, no turning engagements, no giving the Zero a chance to fight back on its terms. And it worked, again and again. In the early encounters, the kill ratios were brutally one-sided. Entire Japanese formations were chewed apart while the Americans lost a single plane, if any. Numbers that had once favored Japan were suddenly meaningless. The shift didn't just live in the skis. It lived in the minds of the men who flew. Training officers in Japan noticed the change in tone from the front. Reports that had once brimmed with victory and confidence now carried a different language. Cautious words, detailed warnings, urgent notes about climbing speeds, diving tactics, and how to avoid the Lightning's kill zone. Intelligence officers began circulating new directives. Avoid prolonged climbing duels. Do not engage above certain altitudes. Never chase a Lightning into a dive. Warnings that all carried the same unspoken message. This is an enemy we cannot fight on equal terms. For a generation of Japanese aviators raised on the myth of the Zero's supremacy, this was almost unthinkable. Their aircraft was supposed to be the hunter. Now, they were being told to run. In a culture where courage was exalted above all else, retreat was more than a tactical necessity. It was a wound to the spirit. For the Lightning pilots, the air war was different. They no longer feared facing Zeros. They respected them. Many American pilots admired the skill and courage of their opponents, but they held the advantage. They climbed knowing the enemy couldn't follow. They dove knowing they couldn't be caught. They owned the vertical dimension of the Pacific War, and that ownership turned every encounter into a one-sided exchange. The Zero's mystique, so carefully built since the first days of the war, began to crumble piece by piece. The aircraft that had once represented unstoppable force now found itself struggling against a machine that didn't play by the old rules. The hunters had become the hunted. As months passed, Lightning pilots began to talk less about the thrill of combat and more about its inevitability. When they met Zeros high above the Pacific, they already knew how the fight would end. Not because of luck, because of physics. And beneath those blue skis, the men in the Zeros felt it too: speed, altitude, fear. The three words that haunted them every time they climbed into their cockpits, knowing somewhere above them, invisible in the sun, the twin-tailed predator was waiting. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the Pacific sky above Bougainville Island was pale and still. Beneath it, one of the most ambitious and precise fighter missions of the war was already in motion. It would not be a massive air battle or a bombing raid. It would be a surgical strike carried out by men who knew exactly what they were hunting. Their target was not an airfield, not a warship, not a factory. It was a man. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the mind behind Japan's early victories, was coming, and the Americans were waiting. For months, U.S. codebreakers had worked in secrecy, reading Japanese transmissions. Then they intercepted the message. Yamamoto would be inspecting forward bases. His itinerary was precise, down to the minute. His plane would be flying in predictable formation along a route over the jungle and sea. It was an opportunity so extraordinary that it seemed almost unreal. To strike at Yamamoto himself was to strike at the very heart of Japanese morale. But the distance was immense, far beyond what most Allied fighters could reach. Most fighters, but not the Lightning. P-38s could cover that distance and still have enough fuel to fight. 16 Lightnings rose from Guadalcanal that morning, skimming the sea at treetop height to avoid radar detection. Every minute of the mission was calculated with ruthless precision. Their target had to be intercepted at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment. If they were late, Yamamoto would be gone. If they were early, they'd be spotted. They had to thread the needle of war with the silence of hunters. At 9:34 a.m., Yamamoto's transport, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, approached Bougainville escorted by 60 fighters. Inside, the admiral sat by a window in full uniform, a man confident in the precision of his schedule. He believed Japanese control of the skis made him untouchable. The idea that American fighters could reach this far into Japanese territory never crossed his mind. Then the Lightnings appeared. From just above the jungle canopy, the P-38s pulled up and surged into the air like silver arrows. Their lead pilot, Major John Mitchell, had guided them flawlessly across 400 miles of open ocean. Now, as the shapes of Yamamoto's escort came into view, there was no time for doubt. 2 sections of Lightnings climbed to engage the escorting Zeros. The other 2 moved straight for the bomber. The Japanese pilots reacted fast, but not fast enough. The Lightning pilots had altitude, speed, and the element of surprise. In seconds, the formation dissolved into chaos. One P-38, flown by Captain Thomas Lanphier, lined up on the bomber carrying Yamamoto. The Betty tried to bank hard, its engine straining, but the Lightning was already on it. A burst of machine gun and cannon fire tore through its wing. Flames blossomed. The bomber began to fall, trailing black smoke across the pale sky. In the jungle below, witnesses later described hearing the engine sputter, then silence, then the thud of impact. Yamamoto was killed instantly. In Tokyo, the news was not made public at first. His death was a blow so severe that it couldn't be absorbed all at once. For the Japanese high command, Yamamoto had been more than a strategist. He was a symbol of the empire's strength. His loss was a crack in the foundation, one that could not be repaired. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became legend. The precision of the mission, the daring of the flight, the cold efficiency of the kill, all of it proved what the Lightning could do. No other fighter could have reached Yamamoto's bomber. No other aircraft could have flown so far, struck so quickly, and returned home. The Japanese pilots who survived the escort would later speak of the shock. They had not expected to see the Lightning there. They had not expected anyone to reach that deep behind their lines. The myth of Japanese control over the outer Pacific had just been shattered in the most personal way possible. The psychological weight of Yamamoto's death rippled through every level of the Japanese war effort. Pilots talked about it in their ready rooms in hushed tones. Commanders avoided mentioning it in open briefings. It was as if saying his name aloud would give the Americans power. They understood now that there was no safety in distance. The Lightning had not only proven its speed, range, and striking power. It had proven something even more devastating. Nowhere was untouchable. For the pilots of the P-38 who returned to Guadalcanal, the mission carried a strange quiet. They had not just shot down another plane. They had struck at the core of their enemy's pride. They had killed the man who had once declared he would run wild in the Pacific. Up in the sky, the Lightning had fulfilled its promise. It had crossed hundreds of miles, evaded detection, and delivered its blow with surgical precision. In that moment, it became more than a fighter. It became a symbol of inevitability. The Zero, once the master of the Pacific, had failed to protect its most revered commander. The Lightning had proven it could reach anywhere. And for the men who had built their legend on untouchable skis, that realization was like a shadow falling over everything they thought they knew. The death of Yamamoto did not end the war, but it marked a turning point, a moment when the hunter was struck in its heart, a moment when the men who had always looked down on their enemy now began to look up and wonder who was waiting above the clouds. By the middle of 1943, something fundamental had shifted over the Pacific. The war in the air no longer belonged to Japan. The empire that had once swept across the seas with supreme confidence was now flying with one eye constantly tilted upward, searching for silver shapes that signaled death. The P-38 Lightning had not just joined the war. It had changed its rhythm. In the early months of the conflict, Zero pilots had flown like hunters. They had dived at will, fought on their terms, and returned home as victors. Every climb, every engagement was underwritten by a single, unspoken belief. No Allied aircraft could truly threaten them. That belief, once as solid as steel, now felt like paper in the wind. The Lightnings didn't come in swarms. They didn't need to. A few aircraft high above the clouds could alter the balance of a battle. They would appear suddenly, attack with violent precision, and disappear just as fast. Japanese pilots began to describe them as ghosts, things that struck without warning. As American squadrons expanded, the frequency of these encounters grew. Every week, more Lightning units arrived. Every week, more Japanese pilots faced the cold truth of altitude and speed. The men who had once flown as kings of the sky were becoming survivors. Worse still was the erosion of Japan's veteran corps. Many of the Zero pilots who had carried the Empire's air war through its early triumphs had fallen in these unequal battles. Their replacements came with less training, less flight time, and less confidence. The experienced men who remained could feel the shift in the air. They knew what their younger comrades were stepping into. The Lightning gave the Americans the ability to fight on their terms anywhere. With its long range, It could escort bombers deep into enemy territory or launch fighter sweeps far from base. The Japanese could no longer rely on distance for safety. Even bases that once felt untouchable were now under threat. In squadron briefings, a new tone crept in. Where once there had been fiery declarations of dominance, there were now cautious words about how to survive an encounter with the Lightning. Commanders instructed their men to avoid climbing duels. They warned against following a P-38 into a dive. They reminded pilots that engaging at high altitude was suicide. These warnings carried a bitter edge. They were admissions of powerlessness dressed as tactical advice, and the pilots who listened knew it. They could feel the pressure building in their chests every time they climbed into their cockpits. It was one thing to face an enemy. It was another to face inevitability. The American pilots felt it too, but differently. They knew they had the upper hand. Their training was sharper, their machines stronger, their logistics deeper. When they climbed into the Lightning, they weren't entering a fair fight. They were stepping into a carefully tilted game. The Zero still had its moments. Down low, in tight turning fights, it could still be lethal in skilled hands. Some Lightning pilots who grew careless learned that the hard way. But those moments were isolated now, not the rule. Every new engagement was another lesson in just how far the balance had shifted. Japanese commanders grew desperate. They began experimenting with new formations, new ambush tactics, anything that might blunt the Lightning's advantage. But nothing seemed to work for long. The Americans adapted faster. Every failed countermeasure deepened the sense of inevitability. By late 1943, the air war no longer revolved around daring dogfights. It was a calculated equation of altitude, speed, and fuel. And in that equation, the P-38 Lightning always came out on top. For the Japanese pilots, the transformation was personal. Men who had once flown with a sense of destiny now climbed with the quiet weight of doubt. They were no longer chasing victory. They were trying to survive. Some wrote it in their letters home. Some buried it behind practiced bravado, but in the sky it was clear. The turning of the war did not arrive with a single thunderclap. It came like a slow tide, creeping into every briefing room, every flight plan, every heart. The hunters had become the hunted, and the empire that had once soared now lived in the shadow of a twin-tailed predator. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke over the Pacific began to clear, the shape of the war that had been fought in the skies became undeniable. The Japanese Zero, once a symbol of untouchable power, lay broken across islands and ocean waters. And hovering above the wreckage of that legend was the aircraft that had undone it, the P-38 Lightning. The Lightning did not simply win air battles. It changed what those battles meant. Before it, air combat was defined by duels at lower altitudes, by turning contests where agility and pilot skill decided everything. The Zero had thrived in that world. It had been born for it. But the Lightning came from a different philosophy, a belief that war could be engineered, calculated, and won through technology and reach. That belief had proven devastatingly correct. For the men who had flown the Zero, this truth carried a bitter weight. Many of them had trained for years, mastering the art of tight turns and aerial finesse. They had been told they were invincible. They had watched enemy aircraft fall before them in the early years of the war. And then they had met something that did not play by their rules. The P-38 refused to dance. It struck from above, shattered formations, and left nothing behind but smoke. Survivors spoke of it not just as an enemy aircraft, but as a presence. They described the way it appeared without warning, how its silhouette against the sun sent a chill through even the most seasoned pilots. They called it the twin-tailed devil, a machine that did not hesitate, that did not break, that always seemed to be where it needed to be. In post-war interviews, some of Japan's best pilots admitted that their confidence had cracked long before the war was over. The Lightning had made them doubt the skis themselves. Once, they had believed in their aircraft as an extension of their own skill. Now, They understood that no amount of skill could bridge the gap between an engine gasping for air and one that still roared at 30,000 feet. The aftermath of that realization would shape more than the memories of the men who survived. It would shape a nation. Post-war Japan embraced technology with the fervor of a country determined never to be left behind again. The lesson they had learned was harsh but unforgettable. Courage is not enough against a machine built for victory. The Lightning itself became a symbol. To the United States, it was proof that technology, training, and industrial might could outmatch even the most fearsome opponent. It was the spear that reached farther than any other, the hand that struck where the enemy felt safe. To Japan, it was a ghost that haunted the night sky, a reminder of how swiftly the balance of power could tilt. Even as newer fighters emerged later in the war, the Lightning's role remained singular. It was the first to take away the Japanese sense of invulnerability. It was the blade that opened the sky and showed the Zero pilots that their era had ended. Long after the war, some of those pilots returned to airfields where their planes had once stood lined up in proud rows. The runways were cracked, the hangars empty. The war they had fought had moved beyond them. Technology had rewritten the language of combat, and for those who had felt the terror of the Lightning's shadow, the memory remained sharp. The United States built thousands of P-38s during the war. Each one represented more than a machine. It was the embodiment of a nation that had learned to wage war not as a matter of honor, but as a matter of production, science, and precision. The Japanese Empire had tried to fight with spirit. The Lightning had answered with math. In one post-war statement, Saburo Sakai, the most celebrated Japanese ace, spoke with a rare bluntness. He said, "The P-38 broke our confidence completely. We believed in the Zero, in our training, in our spirit. But the Lightning showed us that the world had changed. We were fighting the future with the weapons of the past." His words captured the heart of an entire generation of pilots who had gone to war believing in one set of truths and returned home to a different world. The legacy of the Lightning did not end in 1945. Its influence carried forward into the jet age, into doctrines of long-range strike capability, precision interception, and air dominance built not on romantic notions of heroism, but on raw technological superiority. It represented a turning point where warfare became something colder, more exact, and far more lethal. For the men who had flown against it, the memory was not just of defeat, but of revelation. In the sound of its engines, in the gleam of its twin booms against the sun, they had glimpsed the future, and it had destroyed them. The P-38 Lightning did not merely end Japan's dominance in the air. It ended an era. The samurai in the sky, once so sure of their supremacy, learned that courage without power is not victory. It is sacrifice. And their sacrifice became part of the long, relentless story of how technology reshapes war. Even today, when a Lightning flies at air shows, its sound carries an echo of those years. Not just the roar of engines, but the whisper of a moment when the skis of the Pacific turned, and an empire began to fall.